Hello, my name is John Hathcote. I'm an assistant professor at James Madison University. I would also like to thank Jeremy Penn, who unfortunately cannot be here. The title of our presentation is A Dystopian Picture of Critical Thinking Assessment. So there are really two dystopian possibilities within education. In the early 1990s, standardized multiple choice tests came under attack, and this attack really stemmed from the idea that these tests or these assessments failed to align with what we value about student learning and or development, either inside or, let's say, outside of the classroom. This led to what is referred to as an authentic assessment movement in education that calls for a greater alignment between these things. What I am going to suggest to you is that if we are not careful, then we may be led to a second dystopian condition. So this is probably the view that many of us have when we think about standardized multiple choice tests. So here we have a group of anonymous students who are working away to fill in a bunch of bubbles, say on a Scantron. However, what I would suggest to you is that standardization itself does not necessitate an absence or lack of authenticity. So let's look at how this may work. For example, we may have standardized experiments that students would participate in. It's also conceivable that they could design a business model or plans for a building, and this could be done in a standardized way. Or we may even have them build a robot, right? So there are various possibilities here. But let me ask you something. What would occur if we had different students who were taking each of these assessments? And let's also presume that these are going to tap into critical thinking, and we have a common rubric that we've developed in order to score these assessments for critical thinking. And let's say that those scores range from 1 to 5. So here we have our scores. The first assignment received an average of 3, next one an average of 5, average of 1, and so forth. And let us also say that from this sample, we want to say something about an institution itself. So we may say something like, well, on average, we have a critical thinking score of 3. But what are we assuming here? We are assuming that the assignment doesn't matter, right? But in fact, it may matter. And if that's the case, then my observations, my judgments about the institution will be affected by how I sample those assignments. So what if I happened to sample a bunch of assignments with a critical thinking score of 1 or a critical thinking score of 5, right? We may think that there are changes or differences in critical thinking. Perhaps we think we're increasing in critical thinking, but what we're really seeing is a difference in the assignment. So this is the situation that we were facing. We would sample assignments across the institution. These were different assignments, though they were all written work of some form. We would score these using a common rubric for critical thinking, and then we would attempt to make judgments about the institution as a whole. And like I said, the main question here is, well, or the main assumption is that we're treating these assignments as though they were equal when in fact they may not be. So we may see something like this. So there are really two questions that we posed. One, do average critical thinking scores tend to be different across each assignment? So in other words, we hope that this average doesn't differ much across each assignment, that in terms of the amount of variance that exists, this between assignment variance is trivial. But if we don't find that, then the question is, well, can we predict it? So we actually use this rubric to score the critical thinking assignment. So we would look at analytic dimensions as well as a holistic score. With respect to the analytic dimensions, we would look at identification of a problem, students' own perspective, use of supporting evidence, and a discussion of conclusions. And like I said, we would also assign a holistic or overall critical thinking score for that written work. We had 14 teams of faculty members who were paid to rate these assignments for critical thinking, and for this analysis or study itself, we used the holistic scores, the overall critical thinking score, and faculty had to reach consensus about these scores. Now, like I said, we really don't want that between assignment variance to be big, but if it was big, we wanted to predict that by looking at different assignment characteristics. So we sent out a questionnaire to faculty who submitted these assignments, and we would ask them questions about the assignment itself, such as what percent of the final grade was this assignment? Did it receive feedback prior to submission? And to what extent do you believe that this assignment aligned with the analytic dimensions of the rubric? In our final sample, we had to cut some of this out due to small n, but in our final sample we had 343 papers, student papers that were scored for critical thinking, and these papers were nested within 18 assignments. So we used HLM in order to analyze this, and you can think about this as existing at two different levels. So at level 1, we have a student's paper that is nested within these different assignments. So we have each student's critical thinking score for that paper within an assignment. And if you look at the first equation, we are saying that that is a function of an intercept, which is basically just an average critical thinking score for that assignment, plus an error term. At level 2, we have assignment characteristics, and we wanted to see whether we could predict this intercept by looking at different assignment characteristics. Now, prior to this, we look at something that's referred to as an intra-class correlation coefficient, and this would allow us to estimate the magnitude of that between assignment variance that I was talking to you about. And if that is big, then we want to understand it by looking at the level 2 equation. And this is a bit of a simplified picture from what we really did, but it should give you a brief overview of what we're trying to accomplish. So this is a quick overview of the descriptives across different levels. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but you can see that the average critical thinking score was 2.94. About 44% received feedback prior to submission. And if you look at the different dimensions of the rubric, identify a problem, own perspective, etc., you can see that on a 1 to 5 scale, the faculty tend to believe that, yes, these assignments are pretty much aligned with the criteria that we're using in the rubric. About 18% of the total variance we can attribute to that between assignment differences in average critical thinking scores. Though that is not huge, it is also not trivial, right? So the next question that we pose is, well, can we predict that? And I ran various models looking at different interaction terms, controlling for grade point average at level 1. But what I found was consistently across these various models that the student's own perspective seemed to be a strong predictor of that. In fact, that accounts for about, at least independently, about 47% of the total between assignment variance. So in this case, we may ask, well, the extent to which a student, or we may say something like, well, the extent to which a student is allowed, or the assignment allows for the student to articulate their own perspective, accounts for a pretty good size of that between assignment variance. So in that case, we should say, well, what would you do in that situation? Well, we would typically screen these assignments prior to scoring to make sure that they do align or at least lend itself to scoring using the critical thinking rubric. So for example, if we receive an assignment that's a one-page movie review, we're not going to waste our time scoring that for critical thinking. However, if we receive an assignment that is, say, the student is asked to analyze the factors leading to World War I, well, an assignment like that would lend itself to critical thinking. So what we suggested is that in the screening process, you need to pay particular attention to whether the assignment allows for the student to demonstrate their own perspective or illustrate their own perspective. And then we would ideally, after implementing that change, reassess this and see hopefully a reduction in that between assignment variance or differences in the average critical thinking score. However, what I will say is that there was still quite a bit of that variance that no matter what we did with the data that we actually had, we could not account for that. Now, I think that there's another moral to this story, or another take-home message, right? Now, we obviously want our assessments to be meaningful to students in the sense that they tap into skills or knowledge or processes or whatever that's important to the student's life, right? But the challenge is, if authentic assessment is going to realize its promise, right, then we need to somehow account for these differences in assignment characteristics. We've spent a lot of time looking at raters, and we can deal with that source of error fairly well. However, we have not spent enough time looking at assignment characteristics and treating assignments as though they were equal when in fact they may not be, which would occur with an absence of standardization, may be deceptive, and we need to be careful about that. So in other words, in the first dystopia within education, it may be the case that we lost sight of the trees for the forest. In other words, our efforts to make generalized inferences about student learning and or development resulted in losing important information about the student themselves, about the person, right? But what I would also like to suggest to you is that if we are not careful in a second dystopia, we may lose sight of the forest for the trees. Thank you.